we have with us a panel of four what I call local internationalists. John Hooper lives up near Fiesole and is the correspondent for Italy and the Vatican for The Economist, a job he's been doing for many years, though he used to live in Rome and only moved up to the Florentine area a couple of years ago. Welcome, John. We got Georgette Jupe, who's self-styled Texan Tuscan, better known to many as Girl in Florence from her blog site. She's also an editor, has been living in Florence for 14, 15 years. Next up, we have Morgan Fiume. Morgan was born and raised in Florence and then moved to the West Coast for his early part of his life and career. Returned in triumph a couple of years ago and is now resident with his family between the Lungano and a lovely home down in Kentish-shire. Last but not least, we have Marco Del Panta, a career diplomat for the Italian diplomatic service until his last job there as ambassador, the Italian ambassador in Switzerland. And 2 or 3 years ago, Marco decided it was time to return home to Florence. Marco being another born and bred Florentine, and he came back to assist Sindaco Nardella with his re-election campaign, and is now supporting Nardella as a special advisor for international affairs and higher education. That's our panel. Our discussion is inspired by a major keynote speech that the aforementioned Sindaco Mayor of Florence, Dario Nardella, gave at the Palazzo Vecchio at the back end of May, when he started to sketch out a vision for the future of Florence, for the Rinascimento of Florence, the rebirth, and following the crisis that we're still living through. And I'm just going to read one part of the speech which sets the agenda for this meeting. The translation into English is courtesy of our partners, the Florentine. So Nardella said, more or less, the challenge is to embrace this moment as an opportunity to devise and create a new model of social and economic development for the city, which holds together its more traditional vocations of culture, art, tourism, industry, and manufacturing, with renewed function as a smart city, whereby artisan workshops, biotechnology, modern enterprises, infrastructure connecting and supporting businesses, research and professional training centers, selected tourism, and high technology can coexist and fuel one another. The Florence of the future must be more intelligent, inclusive, and greener. That's our keynote speech. So I'm now going to invite John to make his opening statement.
Simon asked me to give some of the macroeconomic framework. In other words, what is the challenge that is facing not only Florentines, but all Italians in this situation. The executive summary, for those of you who can't cope with figures, is that the challenge is monstrous, but there are glimmers of hope. The Italian Statistical Office has estimated that there will be a drop in GDP, in other words, a shrinkage of the economy of more than 8% this year. That is the most optimistic assessment. The most pessimistic puts it at almost 13%. Now, to put that in perspective, after the global economic crisis, 2009, the Italian economy shrank by 5.3%. So we're looking at a recession which is somewhere between half as bad again and one that is more than twice as bad. The good news is that this time around central banks and governments are more prepared. The ECB, European Central Bank, has said to governments in effect, borrow more, spend more, and we will pick up your IOUs to the extent of 750 billion euros. That's allowed governments to shower money on their economies, but, and this is where we get back to some more relatively bad news, Italy is spending much less than others. That's because it's already steeply in debt and because the Italian economy hasn't been growing. Italy is going to be giving away or guaranteeing around about 80 billion euros, Spain 135, Germany almost 1 trillion. So you can see who's going to come out of this faster. Still, some good news, the EU is planning an ambitious program of not only loan guarantees, but also grant aid to countries that are worst hit by COVID-19. The same amount as the ECB, 750 billion euros. It's not yet been approved, but France and Germany are backing it, so you can bet that it will be approved, even if in a maybe watered down version. And Italy should benefit handsomely from that program.
Thank you very much, John. Marco, you're up next.
Thank you, Simon. John gave us a national picture, and I will tell you something about the situation in town. This is a peculiar town. I think that the whole of Italy is seen with a lot of stereotypes, which is our fault. I mean, but also Florence, I mean, is perceived in a way which is not so accurate. Why am I telling you this? Because, I mean, after this crisis, as the mayor said, and as you mentioned, Simon, the Nardella said that we have to turn this crisis into an opportunity. And to do that, we made a kind of a SWOT analysis. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Strength, I would say that this town is pretty attractive. So, I mean, it's not difficult to get people who want to come as a tourist, but also for other reasons. Another strength, and that is why I'm saying that the town is seen with some stereotypes. This town has a manufacturing industry which is much more important, that counts more on GDP than tourism. Tourism is something like 12% of the GDP, and manufacturing industry is almost twice as much. It's around 20%. So that is a strength. It's pretty international, but then there are the weaknesses. So it's a town which is flooded by mass tourism. This manufacturing industry is not very much in the high-tech sector, but it's more in the middle tech sector. And so in this framework, we said that we have to turn the crisis into an opportunity. We have to rethink the economic model of Florence. And of course, we have to go on a higher added value economic model. How to do that? We wanted to strengthen the knowledge economy. Morgan will tell you more about that. I was trying to organize what I call the Stati Generali dell'Alta Formazione, a meeting of higher education institutions. We wanted to promote new initiatives in this area and to better coordinate and do in a quicker way and fundraising for the existing initiatives. Unfortunately, the crisis prevented us from going further with this initiative, which was also conceived as a meeting at national level with the minister. But anyhow, what we have in mind is a new economic model at higher added value, in which higher education becomes one of the key, let's say, economic areas of this town, beside tourism, which will remain, but we want a higher quality tourism, not mass tourism. We want a higher quality tourism in town. And as I used to say during my electoral campaign, we would like to have more students and researchers in town, and less tourists who come here just for one day. In Italian, we say turismo mordi e fuggi. So it's very easy to say and very difficult to implement, but that is the objective we have in mind.
Thank you very much, Marco. Next up, Morgan.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Simon, for putting on this initiative. I think it's very timely, and it's always important to share ideas. I think it's important to point out that one of the first things that we point our finger at is tourism, and as Marco says, maybe that's the most visible, but it really only impacts certain communities of the city. But when I look at it, I can't not compare this to what is known as the paradox of plenty or the resource curse. And that's generally fit to describe countries that have an abundance of a certain natural resource. And I think our cultural heritage in the city is very similar to a natural resource. And where it gives us so much economic prosperity that lots of resources starts going through that sector. And the paradox is, while this is a source of economic prosperity, it tends to create economic stagnation in other sectors. And we can see that, and there's a lot of hidden costs with this resource curse, which means that there's, let's say, inflation of costs, and we can see that in the city. Skilled laborers and jobs being created to service that sector, which is great to have, but is proven to be quite fragile. So the question now is, what is the opportunity, obviously, to still maintain that sector, but to invest and create a more vibrant society, which is based on a diversified economy? And we're very fortunate in Florence that we do have a diversified economy, maybe less visible, but one of the key pillars of that is the educational landscape. So we have the University of Florence, which has about 50,000 students, 1,100 professors. We have about 60 foreign university or college programs here that bring in between 15,000 and 20,000 students. So that is obviously a key pillar to invest in more of a knowledge-based economy. And just to clarify what that means is where consumption and services are created more with human talent as opposed to physical resources or assets. And it's important to point out, though, that the knowledge economy is not just investment in software, but it's the building on scientific advancements and research, applied research to a variety of different fields. So for example, we have an extraordinary pharmaceutical and chemistry industry in Florence, which I think might be the largest. Well, how do we actually build on that with more specialization and more incentive? And just to wrap up, I think Florence has done a lot, and they have some interesting programs such as Invest in Florence, where they've identified over 800,000 square meters of reusable space, beautiful facilities, large facilities that are networked with transportation, and most of them have already been approved for zoning. What I would love to see that perhaps is missing or can be more evident is how the repurposing of these assets tie into a more strategic alignment of how can we tie that into key investments? Who would we like to attract in those areas? Are there opportunities to maybe donate some of these spaces to certain strategic institutions that will then bring in a certain type of jobs or reinforce our knowledge economy efforts? So I hope that some of these very useful initiatives then can be repurposed for more of a long-term strategic assignment.
Thank you very much, Morgan. And to complete the first round of the panel, Georgette.
Everybody, thank you, Simon, and everybody else for this wonderful initiative, because it's important that we're talking about it. I'm not quite as good as Marco at quotes, but I wanted to start one off with one that I love by Helen Keller, which is, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. You know, I look at times like today as very unique. You know, I live in the historical center, and I don't think I've ever heard birds in the morning. Usually it's motorini screeching by my house and somebody yelling, oh! So it's a very unique time indeed. This daily experience of how different our Renaissance city is without the crowds is awe-inspiring at times, but it serves as a daily reminder, a somber reminder of just how many businesses and artisans and people of all sorts of industries are suffering, especially ones that rely on tourism. When I think of sustainable tourism, for me it has always signified raising the quality of life for local residents. while at the same time encouraging a more responsible travel. If I have to be a little bit more succinct, if you build a good city that is great for the people who live here, it is also a good place for people to visit. Well-maintained parks, good public transportation, free museum access for local residents, and it all being quite clear and easy to find in multiple languages. As a person living here for over 7 years in the historical center and about 7 years outside, I've seen so much living here. I've tried to put action in words into action by posting, of course, on my blog about businesses that might not have the social media capability and frankly just need a little bit more visibility. When I think about how difficult the artisans and guides and restaurant owners are dealing with right now, it's hard. You know, there's support from the government, of course, but it is really hard for them to get clear information on how to access that properly. At the same time, I feel like the fact that conversations like this are a show that this is of utmost importance, that perhaps the local community and the international community can come together to come up with some solutions that we can go forward seeing a Florence that is a little bit more caring towards one another and also caring to the people that come and visit. I know that I personally would love to see less of the hit it and quit it visits and more people staying long-term. And that comes with also education as far as what alternative routes and itineraries that people can take. You know, not just encouraging seeing the big blockbuster exhibitions and shows, but also starting in the open air squares and showcasing our bodegas and artisans with better signage even. You know, and I would love to see a little bit more, you know, initiatives when it comes to services in the digital sphere for the businesses that might not be able to afford it, especially in a time right now. So I'm excited to start this discussion, and andiamo, avanti.
Thank you very much, Georgette. Okay, I'm going to start with the interaction. Anyone who wants to intervene, please post a comment on Facebook or raise your hand if you're in the webinar. But I've got 2 or 3 questions and comments which have come through in advance, and they actually all fit together quite well. So I'm going to put all 3 down now and invite the panel to respond. So the first one, very short and sweet, from Christine Wilding in France. Christine actually was a former director of the British Institute. And she's asking about the future of the US study abroad programs and how they can contribute to the future of Florence. Meanwhile, Dr. Diane Archibald, who's a heritage expert from ICOMOS, one of the big international committees, has written in saying, prior to COVID-19, UNESCO expressed serious concerns in regard to the over-commercialization of the World Heritage Site of the city of Florence and degradation due to the out-of-control study abroad nightlife. UNESCO has strongly recommended a sustainable form of cultural tourism in keeping with the authenticity and integrity of a World Heritage Site. And a third one, which is coming in from Rose Magers of Art Viva, which is a very reputable company offering tours to visitors. Why isn't more being done about the unfair, Wild West, out of control black market tourism from accommodation providers and tour operators that has led to over-tourism in Florence and unfair competition that is facilitating the collapse of local operators and businesses? Florence needs to support and encourage local businesses that respect local laws. Okay, so a couple of quite punchy statements there about over-tourism and the existence of less than scrupulous operators, about both the benefits and the disbenefits of the large number of US study abroad programs. So over to you guys for thoughts on those 2 themes. Anyone brave enough to go in first?
Something on the study abroad program, because it's something I'm dealing with. Simon?
Please, Marco. Yeah.
Okay. So no, I'll say something about the not only the American study abroad program, but the international presence of universities. You know, we have something like 47 international universities in town, which is incredible, and we are very proud to have them. And we are trying to encourage, of course, the presence of those students and trying to avoid the complete closure of the next academic year. Normally, the academic year is divided into terms, and unfortunately, the autumn one has already been cancelled by practically all universities, with the exception of the European one, the UI, the European University Institute. So we are trying to do something concretely to recover these programs, to avoid their closure, and to try to have the students back. What are we trying to do? First of all, we made an agreement with the Regione Toscana. You know that in this country, regions are competent for health issues, no, for the sanitary measures. And we made an agreement to make sure that the foreign students have access not only to hospitals, because here the health system is totally free of charge, and we have the universal service, but also the normal medical doctor which prescribes some medical treatment that was not available for foreigners for free, but now we made an agreement to make it for free also for students, also because during this pandemic crisis, students maybe they have some very light symptoms, but they are afraid to have COVID. And so also having access to this very simple medical treatment is important. So there's this agreement with the Regione Toscana, and then we are trying to make the life of students easier in terms of getting the permit of stay. I have to confess that it's not easy in this country to have the permit of stay for those who stay more than 3 months. Our European partners, they're beginning to have some much easier and faster procedures, and we are trying to do the same. Mayor Nardella wrote to the Ministry of Interior, and we're trying to make the life easier for them. Of course, then if they will come back, we don't know. It depends also on national and international aspects. I mean, it's not up to us to decide whether there's quarantine or there's not, which are the foreign countries with which our boundaries are open. You've read today in the newspapers that at European level, there was a first list of countries which have free access to the Schengen area. But what we could do at local level, we're trying to do, because this international presence in town is really key to the international dimension of this town. I mean, we as I said, one of the strengths of this town is its international dimension that we want to further develop, but without these foreign students, Florence would not be the same.
Could I jump in there, Simon?
Please, yeah.
And say that I think I teach at one of those campuses at the Stanford campus here, that perhaps the American study abroad programs could also be integrated into the kind of efforts that Marco was talking about earlier and that Morgan was referring to try to turn Florence into a knowledge economy based city, because what I see are strong links and lots of interaction between the various American universities, but less of the interaction between them on the one hand, and on the other, the University of Florence and also the European University Institute, who maybe a first step towards the kind of national, international, the construction of an international national nexus, are cooperating already on a program to help relaunch the city. And I wonder whether it wouldn't be, isn't scope for trying to bring in the American campuses into this, and perhaps get more students to come over here to study biotechnology or IT, computer engineering, etc., rather than coming over here exclusively to study the the Renaissance.
I mean, if I can just add one thing,
Sure.
'cause I know that there's, there's been some issues and some bad press around the students here and some of the behaviors. I do know that the consulate here tries to meet with almost every program at the beginning of the year just to understand the importance of representing their country and acting with a certain decor, but also to encourage community involvement because, on the positive side, these are terrific cultural exchanges, and you see some of the volunteer spirit with a lot of these students here. Some of them, teach English, some of them volunteer, some of them bring some skills, so such as social media skills and whatnot. So it'd be interesting maybe to even see more formal ways to integrate these students, and I think that's also tied to a lot of these programs are a semester long or perhaps a year long. It'd be interesting to see them actually offer, a four-year undergraduate program or the ability to stay longer. And then the last point is, it'd be great to encourage them to also have postgraduate programs. A lot of these are undergraduate programs, and maybe that's where we can, get more sort of specialization as well.
Okay, I'm going to now bring some more comments and questions in from the audience, which actually pick up on some of the things you've been saying and maybe take it in a slightly different direction. So a question from the Facebook audience, Giovanna Bruno, is asking about whether we could see interaction between the students and the activities of artisans or working alongside influencers and bloggers such as Georgette. Is there any possibility of that? And another one, I'm going to invite Susie Provo to speak now, because I think she wants to say something along that. I'll then bring in one or two more before we go back to the panel. So Susie, I'm allowing you to speak, I think. Can you speak now? Hello?
Am I there?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, I was just wondering whether or not some of this EU money that is earmarked for Italy, in particular for Florence, will be to help sustain some of the artisans and the artists that are so important to furthering the culture here during this time when we don't have much in the way of tourism to help them stay open, stay viable.
Okay. I'm also going to, before we answer the panel, I'm going to invite some more people to get their hands up to speak. So Matteo Duni, I'm now allowing you to speak. Matteo, are you there? No, Matteo's disappeared.
Can you hear me?
No. Yes, we can now. Yep, there you are.
Yeah.
Good.
It just, I had a problem with Zoom, of course. So I found what both John Hooper and Morgan Fiume, as well as Del Panta, said about the knowledge economy extremely interesting. And I caught Del Panta saying Florence would not be the same without the American students. But I would say Florence would not be the same without the teachers of these students either, because in fact, one of the, I think, important aspects of this presence of US programs is that they have allowed a large community of both expats and local scholars to thrive, teaching for these institutions, people that would not have had an easy access to having any other type of job opportunity. And so these people, the teachers whom I represent as the president of the Association of Scholars who teach at American universities, in fact, give a lot to the city in terms of skills, both soft skills and hard skills that they learn in their practice. And I think also what John Hooper was saying, more interaction with local scholarly institutions and universities would be very beneficial, because I feel that many of the skills that we learn in our trade are kind of remaining within the confines of our jobs. They're not shared. They're not out for the city to share and benefit from. And so I think more opportunities for interaction between different institutions and their faculty would be extremely important and would benefit the city as well as the scholars themselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Matteo. Jason Houston's coming through on Facebook. Jason runs the Gonzaga program in Florence. And Jason's comment is, John is exactly correct. Joint graduate degree programs between US institutions and the European University Institute and the University degli Studi di Firenze would be very attractive to US institutions. That's maybe a big opportunity should be explored. I'm just going to allow two more interventions from the webinar, and then we'll go back to panel. So Michael Griffith, I'm allowing you to speak now. Trying to. Are you there, Michael? Okay, Michael, you're on. No? Technical problems? If not, then Richard Demers. Are you there, Michael? Is your microphone off? Okay, Michael, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. So Richard Demers?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on. Yep.
Thank you. Great pronunciation of my name, by the way. I heard in your summary of the mayor's speech that one of the parts of his vision is to develop Florence as a center of technological excellence. And so my question is about this, you know, the possibility of us imagining that Florence could become a hub of technological innovation, sort of like San Francisco or Silicon Valley. Now, based on my short experience in Florence, I feel that Florence has one of the elements necessary for this, and that is the talent. There is the University of Florence, has a really strong physics department and optics department, and there's also Archetri, where I was fortunate enough to work for 2 years. And Florence definitely has the capacity to attract great talent. But what I'm wondering about, if your panelists could comment on, is what about the business infrastructure needed for the birth and gestation of technology startups? Is there venture capital? Is there seed funding? What are those kind of, are there barriers there for an entrepreneur, say, thinking about starting a technology startup?
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Now, just before I ask the panelists to respond, I'm also going to draw their attention to the comments that are running along the webinar. Marco has already responded to a couple, which is great. But if you've got a moment, panelists, to see some of those comments, I'm not going to read them all out, is what I'm saying. So the questions were taking us looking further at how the American universities can contribute to the intellectual underpinning for a knowledge economy. What can be done by more fully integrating the American students and support for the artisans and the bottega sector. And then the third, relating also to that, is some considerations around startup culture and the knowledge economy. So Georgette, you didn't get to speak on the last round. If you would like to come in maybe on some angle of that, that'd be great.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I've had the pleasure to be a guest lecturer at several American universities and talking about what I do for work and the blog and just basically anything regarding writing and living in Florence, and also my experience living here in general. And it's always been a wonderful thing. The only problem is that it's almost always a one-off, you know, come once in a while, whole new group of students. So, you know, one problem I think I've always seen in Florence, and maybe it's a problem that's more to do with business and other things, but, you know, students that stay, you know, one semester, it's a very different experience for people that stay a year, 2 years, 4 years. It's harder to create a lasting community within those students, and then also harder for me to be able to invest my time into mentorship and things like that without having a little bit more of a stability when it comes to growth with any kind of collaboration. So for example, I love working with students because it keeps me young and I'm allowed to, I learn a lot from them. It's just as much as they learn from me. So, you know, any way, and one thing I would love to see more, and perhaps it might even already exist, is just more interaction between, you know, the local and international students. So having more mixed groups between Italians and the study abroad students would be wonderful. Bringing them to artisan shops, explaining how everything goes, and maybe, and I'm sure there's internships that are available, but make the red tape easier, because, you know, I think for me, the struggle living here has always been simplification. You know, how can we, if you put a barrier immediately, you're more likely to give up right away. So I think if we can eliminate those, especially during a time like this, and make it easier for programs to start and integrate with other universities, and make that, you know, communicating that to people like me and other local publications, so that we can share this news and bring this to the public, would be wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Other comments?
I just in on the EU aspect, where the money is going to go, to clear that up pretty quickly, because the answer is we just don't know. The program has not been approved yet. The mechanism for the distribution of funds, we don't know anything about, so it's just too early to know exactly how that money is going to be spent. I'll come back later on, if I may, on something that Mr. DeMeo said.
Can I say something on this, Simon?
Yeah, please do.
To answer the question of John, and other panelists on the integration of foreign students and American students into town and relations with other universities, I cannot agree more. Some years ago, I was Secretary General of the UI, of the European University Institute, and I was so surprised to see when I arrived there that it was an ivory tower, completely separated from town, from the local community, from the university, totally deconnected. So my effort was to connect it with the local university, with the Florence University, with the local community, with the municipality of Florence. I invented the Festival d'Europa, the European festival. The purpose was exactly to bring the institute into town. So I cannot agree more. We have to do the same with the American and foreign universities. Why are we so keen to have an easier way to get the visa, no? The permit of stay, not the visa, the permit of stay? Because if you stay here only 3 months, if the students stay here only 3 months, they don't have a chance to really integrate, to do something, I don't want to use the word serious, but I mean more important from the cultural and intellectual point of view. If you stay more than 3 months, you really have a chance of better integrating and to perform some activity which is of higher, let's say, intellectual value. So it's absolutely vital. Second issue, very, very quickly, how to develop the knowledge economy, how to develop new technological initiatives in town. It's what we're trying to do with the initiative I was mentioning, the Stati Generali dell'Alta Formazione. Then we called it Florence for the Knowledge Economy. We're trying to develop new initiatives. Just to give you an example, there's something which is going to open in the next months, which is a hub for startups in Oltrarno, just beside the British Institute. It was an old military barracks, and now it's been turned into an incubator of startups. That's the new model, you know, for economic development. We're trying to do other initiatives such as this one. What concretely I'm trying to do now, just to give you an example, we have an old building which is now a place for elderly people who meet there, you know, Casa per Anziani in the suburbs of town, and we're trying to convert it into an academy on climate change and let's say green economy, led by Professor Stefano Mancuso. Some of you might know him. You know, he writes, there's an article on Repubblica also today. He's the theoretician of you know, the green economy and reforestation also in town. So these are the kind of initiatives that we're trying to put forward and to implement to develop the knowledge economy. Where the money comes from, it's necessary, it has to come from Europe. As John said, we don't know exactly how much and how it will be spent. but there's a historical chance in this year of having some money at the disposal. You know, in a country with the debt that we have, normally there's no money to perform new policies. Now we have a chance, we have the money. So it's up to us to use it in a positive way at national and also local level.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to intervene again because we need to go back to the audience. There's getting quite a lot of comments that want to steer the conversation back towards the issues around tourism and sustainable tourism. A couple of questions have come in. Are there any strategies to limit the cruise ship industry that brings visitors in a very short visits? There's another one. What do you mean by high quality tourism? How might this aim be achieved? A little bit earlier, Sarah Baker asked what was meant by the phrase black market in tourism. I can answer that one very briefly. It's tour operators who are not regulated and do not carry insurance and are not paying any taxes. It's Airbnb, which is operating in Never. Those are the two big and obvious ones, but there's various other ways in which describing the mass tourism market as a Wild West is not wholly unfair. We'll steer the conversation towards some of these issues, and that's one of the other comments is how can there be such a thing as over tourism? If we reduce the amount of tourism, you reduce the income, where's the GDP going to come from? I'm going to invite people who've got their hands up patiently in the webinar to talk, and we'll theme it around the tourism, but other things that come up now from these questions. So Elizabeth Vincent, I'm allowing you to talk. Trying to. Are you there, Elizabeth? The mute button's gone.
Hear me?
Yeah, hello.
Oh, hello. Thank you for allow me to talk. My husband's a goldsmith, and we have a small store near Via Gioberti, which is on the other side of the Viale. And I have to say that with the lockdown, one of the biggest things I noticed was the huge difference for life outside of the Viale and life in the historic center. And I just would like to ask the panelists, I mean, it's great to have an economy, local economy with students or international scholars or international tourists, but what are they going to do? Are they considering maybe bringing back residents into the historic center again, and how? Because I think the local economy could really use it, because if there's another virus or another lockdown, which could happen, I'm not saying it's going to, we may have to consider going back to things before mass tourism was a problem or an issue. And also because the artisans in the city are suffering terribly. And I think it's an important issue because a lot of these artisans are older. Not all of them have their families behind them that are going to sustain their craftsmanship once they're no longer here. A lot of them are retiring or dying off. And I think it's something that we have to consider because it's part of the cultural identity of the city. It's extremely important because once they no longer pass on their trades, they'll be lost forever.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'll now pass the word to Nina Su. Are you there, Nina? Hello, Nina.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Hi. I have a question about addressing the talent, because I lived in Florence for 4 years before I graduated and moved to Hong Kong. But and during my time in Florence, I saw that there is a lot of talent and in the technology and the scientific sectors, but how do we retain that talent? I think is my question, is because how do you compete against, say, you have a really talented Florentine in the tech or scientific sector, how do you retain him and compete against, say, an employer in the Silicon Valley or in Asia?
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. I'm going to hurry it along because we've got quite a lot of people wanting to intervene. Sarah Amrine? over to you if you can hear that. Yeah, hi.
Hi. So I'm an American. I've been living in Florence for about 20 years now. I'm also an artisan. And I recently had to close my store as a result of COVID because I was in the historical center and very highly dependent on tourist traffic. I'm also the president of Creative People in Florence, which is a cultural association. And what we're doing right now is I wanted to kind of, somebody had mentioned, high tech, making Florence high tech. And we're actually in the process right now of creating a mobile app that is meant to help find artisans in Florence. So there's an integrated map that has dots on it that will show people how to find the artisans getting from wherever they are in the center of the city. If they're in Piazza Duomo, it will show them which artisans are close to them. If they're in Santo Spirito, it will show them who's close to them. And we're also working on a way that it will connect them to their online stores as well. So even if somebody can't come to Florence right now, they can still access the artisans of Florence. They can still get to them through their online shops or through, the system that we're working on. So I guess mine is not as much a question, but more of a, I just wanted to speak on behalf of artisans because I know that a lot of us are struggling and having a really hard time right now. And our association is really working hard to try and find ways of supporting and promoting these artisans. So we're hoping that this app is going to be up and running by the end of August. Of course, it takes a lot of time to develop something like this. It's the first time for us that we're doing anything like this. And of course, any kind of support or help from the community, from the city, from other institutions, collaborations, would always be appreciated by us. So if anyone wants to talk further about that, I'd love to have a more in-depth conversation about it.
Okay, Sarah, maybe you'll put your contact details up in the comments section. Just one more before we go back to the panel from Wendy Hutchinson. Wendy, you're on.
Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I don't know that I really have a question. I did send in an email other than to say, as a Canadian who has come to love Florence and feel very protective of it, I first discovered Florence, Firenze in 2010 when on my first trip to Italy to Certaldo, to the International School of Ceramics there. And I've become very close with the owners, founders of the school and what they've been dealing with COVID, but just sort of bringing in all the conversations that I've been having, like what can I do as a foreigner? And, Ontario College of Art and Design University has had a campus in Firenze since 1975. So it's just not the American universities, and they do have a one-year study abroad program. So going back to, I think, what Susie was saying, like how can we integrate local people on longer short-term stays and to get to know the city better, because I'm totally on board with sustainable tourism, and I myself seek out unique and unusual places off the beaten path. It's unfortunate that it does take me away from the center, but at the same time, I've discovered all kinds of bottega and artisan shops and trattoria. And I tell my friends from outside of Firenze, I bring them to Firenze on a little day trip. Like, oh, you know so much more about Florence than we do. So I just want to know, again, as a foreigner who's been there, I've been there 10 years, almost every year since 2010. How can I help? Because as well, I'm not Italian, but Canada has a strong Italian connection to Italy. We have a very impressive Italian Cultural Institute in Toronto. We have large Italian populations, and we have schools both in whose goals are education in art, but also in tech. We have OCADU, we have Nova Scotia School of Art and Design, we have Sheridan, we have Ryerson. So I'd like to see more of that, again, making those connections so we can bring knowledge, share knowledge, and support that ongoing exchange in a way that's viable to the city. Have I made it?
Thank you very much, Wendy. I'm going to draw you to a close now because we're getting a bit short on time. It's 5 minutes to the top of the hour. We can, of course, go beyond the top of the hour if the panelists are up for that, and we Wednesday evenings normally run over a little bit. So we'll keep going a little bit longer. But I think I'd like to ask the panel now to comment on this issue about what practical action can be taken to improve the quality of tourism. Everyone says in the mass tourism is becoming a problem. People talk about slow tourism, about lower volume, higher quality. What can we actually do practically as a city, as entrepreneurs, as craftsfolk, small business, residents, visitors, to start making progress in that direction with this frankly unique opportunity when tourism is currently on hold? So who wants to go first on that one?
Can I just put in something very quickly and say that I think to some extent this problem, if it is a problem, is going to solve itself. And if you look at the cruise industry, how many people are now going to want to lock themselves away on a cruise liner? That will stop a lot of people being disgorged at Livorno for exactly the kind of Morde Fuji tourism that Marco referred to earlier on. Air travel is going to become probably a lot more expensive. Rail travel already has become more expensive. So there is that, that we may be entering a period in which tourism is going to become more of an elite pastime. And that obviously has all kinds of implications in terms of class, wealth, etc. But it may be a new reality.
Can I add something? This is a possible scenario. I don't know if there's another scenario, which is the return to the pre-COVID era. It's also possible because, I mean, we used to have in this town 14 million tourists a year, which is an incredible figure. I don't know if we want to have that number. What we're trying to do is to have what I said, higher quality tourism. What does that mean? I mean, we want people to come here not just to have a panino and have a tour of 2 hours and then go away, but somebody who comes here to appreciate the art and culture and artisans and social life in town. Turismo congressuale, how do you say in English? I mean, what we're trying to do is to have a better system to develop people who come here for a longer period and for that kind of tourism. To have that, you have to develop, of course, you have to have a proper airport, you have to have a congress center, you have to have fairs at national and international level. So this is a means to try to develop also another kind of tourism. We don't want to renounce to the normal tourism that we had before, but we would like to encourage people to stay here for a longer period. Probably we'll have to cap the number of apartments which are rented to for short stays to tourists. It's not an easy task because there has to be legislation which allows the municipality to do it, and it has to be national or European, and we were trying to develop also something at European level. And to reply also to a question that was posed, the mayor said that he wants the Florentine to live, to go back to the center of their town. Now, most of the apartments are rented to foreigners. It's not easy to have the Florentine back. You have to have an efficient transport system. You have to have some fiscal incentive. You have to cap the number of apartments which are rented to for short stays. So it's not an easy task, but all of the policy that not only after the crisis that we were trying to implement also before the crisis, they were aimed to this effort of bringing the Florentine back to the center and to have a, let's say, higher quality tourism. It's not an easy task, but we are trying to do it.
I would like to jump in on that as well, because this is a topic that is close to my heart, knowing that, you know, most guides that I know, even though they rely, of course, on tourism as their #1 income, also have a wealth of knowledge that goes beyond, like I was saying before, the top spots. So, you know, if there is a way that we, together with the city, anybody who's living here who's already promoting slow tourism and using this wealth of talent that we have in the city. And, you know, I mean, I can't even think about how many times I've written the local government, maybe with some proposals, but just saying, you know, let's get involved in actually coming up with some different itineraries and giving some sort of incentives for people to support these local bodegas. If that's, I know that, you know, in form of a card or some sort of discount or something like that, or giving them the artisans subsidies in some way. But anything that encourages people falling in love with the story of craftsmanship in general is how it's going to change. Because, you know, if people are watching and reading this information before they come, because it's going to be a long time perhaps before at least American tourists can come back. And if they have that knowledge and they're excited about it already, and then they come here and they know that they can visit these places which are easily marked thanks to creative people in Florence's apps, or really clear information on websites, and that this information is being shared on a daily basis, I think we'll see that, because from what I see, people are really excited about coming to Florence and supporting these smaller institutions. I get messages like that every single day. And, you know, I also think museums here too, I mean, we need to also be attracting local tourists to support quality craftsmanship, you know, getting Italians to enjoy it and be part of the conversation, as well as when people come from outside together. So, you know, if we have both of that, imagine how amazing Florence can be.
Right. A thought occurred to me, Marco. You mentioned that at European level, some of these policy issues come out. Of course, the challenge of mass tourism is not unique to Florence, even nearly. I was in Gdansk in the summer a couple of years ago, and it was like Florence in the middle of summer. It was equally crowded and chaotic. So I wonder whether the other cities are seeing this challenge in a similar way to Florence, and whether the degree of knowledge sharing of what can work and make things better. One of the comments coming in from Facebook is referred to imposing heavy tourist tax rates to discourage casual tourism and raise more income for the city. An example of an idea. So I don't know whether Florence is in active dialogue with other cities around Europe which have got these challenges.
Certainly, yes. There's a group of European towns that are coordinating their activity in this area. It's called the Over-Tourism Group or something like that. I can't remember. It's our Assessore Cecilia Del Re who participates in these meetings, and the members of the group are those towns that are more affected from the problem of over-tourism. Now, of course, after the COVID crisis, speaking about over-tourism in a town like this one, and also the others that are totally empty or almost empty of tourism, sounds really something which is part of our past. I mean, if the scenario that John was mentioning, according to which tourism will not start again with the same path, with the same figures of the past, then the problem will be automatically solved. If we will go back to the same tourism model, then we'll have to bring back to the attention of the European Union the issue and find some solution some legislative solution. I mean, if we want to limit the short-term rent, we have to have some national or European legislation. So it's a problem also of finding the correct legal basis. You know, it depends whether it's considered to be tourism, if it's providing, if Airbnb, for example, can be dealt with inside the service providing area, then the legal basis is another one. So there's a debate about the possible approach. But for the moment, we have to cure the consequences of the crisis. But if tourism will be back again with the same figures, we'll have to bring to the attention of the European decision makers this issue. For the moment, we don't know.
Two interesting comments coming through from the Facebook live stream audience. From Molly Kellogg, I read, suggests that you don't cap the number of short-term locations, Airbnb, etc. Instead, introduce a minimum number of days rental. My hometown, Santa Barbara, California, has done that, and it can result in people staying longer. It's an interesting idea, and if Santa Barbara is there as a precedent, maybe we can look at what Santa Barbara did. Helen Farrell, our partner, editor of the Florentine, comes through saying, we need to create online opportunities and products for the US market. Florence lovers are happy to buy now with a view tomorrow. Florence bonds is her idea. So get some good monies coming in from our Florentine friends in the States. Okay, so we are over time. I'm just going to check in with the panelists that you're happy to go a few more minutes because there are still quite a lot of comments and questions coming in. Are you good? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the webinar people with their hands up. We've got 4 who I will invite to speak, and I'll ask all 4 of you, please, to be pretty succinct because we are running out of time. So Diane Archibald, you're on. Should be.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I want to I'll try very quickly. There are 2 points I want to touch upon. I actually wrote it here in the chat. UNESCO, I don't want to, I'm listening to you, Morgan, and I think we cannot minimize the seriousness of the study abroad situation in the city of Florence, which is also, I'm hearing, a strong economic factor, and encouraging from UNESCO and ICOMOS perspective to see that more creative ways are being looking at that. You must be aware that Florence, before COVID-19, was in the process of being, now the designation of a World Heritage Site being taken away. You received 3 letters from UNESCO asking you to act upon this and failed to do so. And a major part of that was the degradation of the city caused by a certain approach to study abroad life that UNESCO sent in a monitoring team that did a full report with videos of just how extensive that degradation was and that how it contributed to the deconstruction of the authenticity and integrity of why Florence is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And as Marco Del Ponte has said, it seems almost ironic and surrealistic now to discuss this, but for Florence to return to that model would be quite serious. Now, there are UNESCO and ICOMOS Italy created a task force to work with the city of Florence. And ICOMOS and UNESCO works with other World Heritage Centers that are dealing with these exact same problems of mass tourism and erosion and degradation. And those models are thought out of by informed practitioners and heritage experts at the international level who are right there in your University of Florence. And your Italy ICOMOS, which is part of this task force, the president lives in Florence and is part of the development of the ICOMOS Agenda 2030 and cultural sustainability, or sustainability of cultural tourism is very closely linked to economics. So you have economics and culture coming together to provide a sustainable, quality, authentic way of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. Moving on to Susie Provo. You're on.
I'll be very brief. And I'm also talking about the study abroad program. My daughter came to a study abroad program in 2009, and she did the Syracuse program, which does encourage students to go to homestays. And I really think that if other programs would require that versus kids just being put up in apartments where it's more conducive to just being a party person than a part of a family, I think this would really help in keeping down the negative view that most Florentines and expats and people who live in the city have of raging groups of students, partying until 2 and 3 in the morning. They would feel more like a part of a family, more like a part of the culture, and they will better understand Italian family culture, which is an incredible institution in and of itself. I think it's a benefit for the students, but it's also a big benefit for Florence.
Thank you very much. Brief, please, Sean Hudson. Are you there, Sean? Not there, Sean? Can't hear you. Going, gone. Okay, we'll go to Charles Adler, who's got his hand up.
What happened?
Yeah.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, is that Sean or Charles?
It's Sean.
Okay,
It's
Sean,
Sean.
you're on. Yeah, okay, Charles, you have to wait. So Sean, go.
Sorry about that. I was in Florence and the region for business 5 times last year. My most recent trip was January. I just booked my first trip back for July 17th to restart a project. Would it be a great time now for Italy to take a look at streamlining and expanding the Italian startup visa program, as well as just streamlining the application process and vetting applicants much quicker so we can, if we have an interest in setting up something in Tuscany, in Florence, or anywhere in Italy for that matter, that we can get the process started and an approval quicker, faster.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last from the webinar people with hands up, Charles Adler. You're on. Charles, you need to unmute yourself. Not there? No, Charles.
Okay, I think I'm on now. Okay, just a thought that I think will join together both the ideas and the talents and positions of the people who've been speaking. In terms of a different kind of tourist, I want to suggest that there is a kind of tourist for which there would be interest, at least in America, but I think in other places as well, that would suit us in many different ways, but would require the city as well as institutions in order to make it possible. And that is the retiring people. There are a great number of Americans who are at the age of retirement, but not at the age of retiring from life, for whom the notion of a year, for example, as a student in Florence, that takes advantage of what Florence has, that would economically contribute to the comune in a very good way. But it requires things like dealing with the permesso di soggiorno issue, dealing with eligibility and accessibility of medical services. That sort of thing could, I think, be very attractive to a small, to be sure, but quite large, quite significant economically, group of people who, and there is no better place that I can think of in the world than Florence for that.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. I'm just going to do one post that's come through the Facebook audience, and then I'm going to throw to the panelists, and if you each one would like to just conclude, I think, because we need to come to an end now with a few, just a couple of comments towards the end. Particularly, I'll give you a moment to think whilst I read this out. Particularly looking at practical action that we can try and take, working with the Comune and others to realize to solve some of these problems. And realize some of these aspirations. So from Helen Bailey on Facebook, who's says that she's a guide, a tour guide, and she feels that the situation is completely out of control. As a guide, I'm often both verbally and even unintentionally physically abused in the Uffizi, for example. And she's suggesting no-go zones for large groups, so no large groups to go to Santo Spirito, for example, and create regulations for bike tours. So she's advocating for some pretty serious action to regulate and control the mass tourism, which her street level experience is completely out of control. So folks, round the panel with some concluding thoughts, and as I say, action orientated if possible. John, you've got your light on. Do you want to go first? Or somebody else?
I wasn't aware that I had it on. But
you must have shuffled in your seat.
I'm very happy to go. No, I just wanted to steer things back a little bit more towards the idea of the knowledge economy. And I think that one of the earlier speakers made a very good point, talking about the wealth of intellectual talent that there is here. I must say that when I came to Florence, it reminded me very much of going to live in a place like Oxford or Cambridge or Boston. I had some fascinating conversations within a short time of arriving with Italian academics teaching at the University of Florence, or in some cases at the American Study Abroad programs. So I think the possibilities are there, that somebody else put their finger on the real problem, which I'm hoping that Morgan will pick up on in his concluding comments, which is how do you actually make this happen in a society where, for example, venture capital is very underdeveloped. Something or other needs to be done in that area, I think, before you can get the kind of stimulus that led to universities in, for example, Stanford, generating a technological periphery around it that then becomes an industrial center.
Called Silicon Valley.
Indeed.
Who's next?
I can add to that. I just wanted to put one comment, building off what Georgette said, just on part of the solution for over-tourism. Obviously, limiting the number of buses coming in per day, that sort of the hit and run tourism is key, but it's really concentrated in a small part of the city. And I think there are over 80 museums in Florence, hundreds of other sites. And so, what is the solution to try to distribute and make those more discoverable? So it's not just, the David and the Uffizi, which then concentrates everyone in one specific area. And then on the knowledge base, to just follow up on what John was saying, the intellectual, the human capital is definitely here. And I think, Florence reminds me of London in a way, because we have such a skilled and diverse collection of people and human capital. I think there are things that are behind, especially on regulation, where the incentives for entrepreneurship are still, we struggle with that a little bit. And there are strides forward. For example, the incubators space that Marco was talking about, and Anna Bianca, I mean, these are fantastic, critical ingredients. Venture capital, I think, is a little bit behind, but it's still there. What I think the opportunity is to look at certain industries that don't require, Silicon Valley is obviously built over many years, came from motherboards and chips and whatnot. I think right now you look at areas like Malta and Estonia that have done this sort of generational and quantum leap by offering digital visas, blockchain infrastructures that facilitate investment, liquidity, transparency. Like these are all things that are happening, and you see certain examples of that they've been able to adopt them very quickly just because the technology is readily available. And it's a shame to see a lot of US-based companies going to Eastern Europe, where now not only are we at parity on cost, we might even be less expensive than those countries, and we have the talent, but the regulation has not caught up for it. So that my big hope is that the regulation does catch up, because I think we have most of the pillars here, besides obviously being one of the most desirable places to live in the world.
Thank you, Morgan. Georgette.
Maybe I can say something on visa.
Sure, Marco.
Sorry, Georgette, you want to go in? You this first.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say this is so exciting. I love when I'm already thinking we need another 5 chats to go into this further, because there's so many different aspects that, I didn't even think about. I'm also passionate about small group tourism and encouraging that as much as possible. When you see 20 people in a flag, I can't even cross the bridge with my dog to get home. I mean, that's not definitely encourage anyone to want to move here, long term at least. So, having a way that we can live. Coronavirus maybe has done that for us because we can't congregate in big groups, but encouraging that going on would be tantamount to this sort of slow tourism angle we want. And I feel like it's important that we streamline cultural and local events in a way that's easily accessible in a digital way, whether that be through apps or websites. And the Comune, I feel, could do more on that aspect, because sometimes things are really hard to find. We used to have a great PDF of events list, also in English, that has disappeared in the former years, which is why I do that for my blog. But I feel like if we did it together, I could even find out about more events that are often listed last minute. So, a lot of people plan their trips in advance, and if they knew about a lot of these events before, then it could rise a richer tourism. And also a friend of mine talks to me about having conferences and events with local artisans and business owners that are accessible, because often the ones that we see in the city have a high cost of participation. So if we can make this a little bit easier for them to participate regularly, I think we could see a change. And most of all, just to conclude, I think it's important that we don't forget this conversation when our lives change and get busier as things get back to a sort of normal. This needs to be an ongoing conversation that we have. So I hope to be part of it.
Thanks, Georgette. Marco.
Yes, I'm trying to reply to some of the points that were raised by our audience. I'm very happy to hear and to read that the startup visa was mentioned, because I was the initiator of that visa. I must tell you that after a couple of, some months or 1 year that we launched this new kind of visa, we saw that it was not actually a bestseller. So we introduced another kind of visa, which is the investor visa. So not necessarily somebody who comes to establish a startup, but also somebody who comes just to invest in the country, not only in the industrial sector, but also in the financial sector and so on. Since it was mentioned with the request to upgrade it, I'm curious to say, maybe I would like to have some more concrete comments on what is perceived as not functioning. I mean, now I'm on a leave, but I'm still an official of the Foreign Ministry. If we can improve it, of course, any comment is most welcome. One final point I would like to make, that we are trying at national level, but also at Florentine level, let's say, to attract investments. This city is interesting mainly for real estate initiatives, and we're trying to have something more, industry, not only real estate. I said at the beginning that 20% of GDP is manufacturing industry and 10 to 12% is tourism. So there's a lot of industry, but we are trying to have to internationalize also the industrial sector. It's much, much more difficult because we are in Italy. It's an environment that is not the most attractive in the world, and which is perceived in a much worse way than reality. I do not elaborate on this, but I mean, it's not ideal, but it's perceived as even worse than what, not only me, but I mean, there are some concrete studies about that. So It's not easy to attract that kind of investments, but we are striving to do it. The COVID crisis made us think about a new model of development. We want to have more industry, more high-tech industry, more researchers, more students, and less tourists that come here only for a couple of hours.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you very much to everybody on the panel, and thanks to everyone who's participated in the webinar, and thanks to everyone who's followed us on the Facebook streams. I hope I got around most of the comments and questions which were coming in. We've run over by half an hour, but I don't think that's because we were waffling on too much. I think it's been a lively and dynamic debate, and as Georgette said, many themes coming up. We at the British Institute, as I said at the beginning, want this to be the start of a series of similar events, which we're calling Firenze NOW, with an exclamation mark. And I think in many ways this webinar has set an agenda for 3 or 4 sessions in the autumn, when we can dive deeper into some of the themes and ideas which have come up. And I'm looking at my panelists to say I'll be talking to you about sometimes participating, but also helping with networking to bring in other people, other voices to help us guide us on this journey through exploring the future of Florence and what can practically be done. What I will do is I will, we have recorded this session and we'll publish it on our YouTube channel tomorrow afternoon probably. We've also got a lot of comments coming in on both the webinar and the Facebook, which we'll analyze. So I'm putting my hand up to say I'll produce a fairly brief digest of some of the main themes and ideas which have come out of this, which are worth taking forward in further debates, discussions, sharing with our friends at the Comune and other structures in the city. Because the aspiration here, British Institute's role in all this is simply to be a convening space between Florence, the city, and the community that is here, and our global friends and supporters. Because using this technology, as you could hear from the voices, we've got people zooming in from all over the world, and that's fantastic. So we'll do all of that. And I'll put that out next week, probably as an attachment to the weekly What's On newsletter. If any of you are not getting your What's On from the British Institute, you need to get it, because that's where we tell you what's happening. And just look us up on the website, or drop me an email at director@britishinstitute.it, and we'll get you onto the mailing list. As always, a commercial. The next 3 Wednesdays until we take the summer break, we've got 3 really high quality lectures, starting with Lisa Kobowicz talking about New Jerusalem, which is the relationship between the Medici and the Jewish community during the Renaissance. Then Head of History of Art Jeremy Boudreau is doing the 4th of his virtual walkabouts, looking at the Sesto San Pietro Schieraggio, which is, for those who don't know where that is, that's right in the center around Piazza della Signoria. And then finishing the season, we've got Jason Arcles, who's a sculptor and his art historian living in Florence, who is going to talk about the 200-year-old tradition of Americans coming to live in Florence to make sculpture. So that rounds out our season of lectures for the next 3 Wednesdays. Then we'll take a summer break, and we'll be back in September. And all being well, breaking news, folks, we will try and reconvene at Palazzo Lanfredini in the beautiful Sala Ferragamo, so we can start doing face-to-face events with appropriate social distancing, but all of them will be tricked up to have the Zoom and the other streaming so that the global audience can be there as well. There'll be hybrid, live, face-to-face and virtual. So that's looking forward a bit. And last but not least, broken record, please remember to donate so that we can continue to help the Firenze per Firenze campaign, and also keep the Dell British Institute afloat at this time of turbulence and difficulty. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much for everybody. And that is it, exactly half an hour after we were supposed to finish. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Good night. Be in touch. Ciao.